Hello, movie executives, and welcome to Circuit Court Entertainment, where we discuss how laws and history affect all forms of media. I'm your host, Mina, and today we are discussing the breakdown of the studio system and how movies are distributed. It's a big topic, so let's get into it. So, what is the studio system? The studio system is complicated, but the gist of it was this. Starting around 1928, the major studios, Paramount, Warner Brothers, MGM, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, and some minor ones, Universal, Columbia, and United Artists, would sign actors, directors, and etc. to long-term contracts, like years long. Once movies were made, they would be sold to movie theaters, also owned by the studios. They were not always told the complete picture of what they were purchasing. For example, they may know they may be agreeing to buy a John Wayne picture and 4 others, but not what those 4 others were. If they were lucky, they got a title or actors, but that was it. This was also during the Great Depression, so film and radio were cheap and safe bets for entertainment when there wasn't much joy to be had. While the studio system allowed for people to keep working, it also did not allow much in the way of competition or talent discovery. Singing in the Rain, released in 1952. While it is absolutely showing off an idealized version of the studio system during its transition to talkies, the cracks of the studio system are seen in it too. Don Lockwood, one of our male leads, is constantly paired up by the studio with a woman named Lena Lamont because they have good chemistry on film. All of them only work for one studio. People don't really get cast as much as the studio heads decide to give them certain roles, and they get locked into them, etc. Singing in the Rain is a fantastic movie, don't get me wrong, but they had a problem that only really existed under the studio system, and a bad movie as things transitioned to talkies, but that was common at the time. To be clear, there were advantages in the studio system from a production standpoint. For example, if they signed a star early, they could keep them on payroll for cheap. They were free to fiddle around on casting or production depending on other factors, i.e. they could make sure an expensive set or costume could be used multiple times. And if people did get along well, then it wasn't as much of a hassle to use them in repeated productions. The downsides, however, are fairly obvious. It was so easy to get stuck in a rut. If there were any drama, it was hard to break up, and the only competition was between the production studios themselves. No real casting or auditions. If they got stuck or had a run of bad movies, it would be harder to change things up and see what went wrong, and the movie theaters were frustrated at buying everything sight unseen. But it was the Great Depression. Movies were an incredibly cheap way to kill time, and gave either humor or catharsis to a country that was going through it. The cracks may be there, but no one wanted to rock the boat. And soon after the Great Depression was over, there was World War II. The U.S. government just had other things on their mind, and movies were a great way to spread propaganda. It was mostly documentaries, I am putting that in sarcasm quotes, and shorts. But there were a few films and cartoons in there too. Donald Duck famously has Das Fiera's face, and Popeye got in on the action too. But his got really racist, so we are just going to move on from there. It wasn't until after World War II that the U.S. could start building an antitrust lawsuit. And if you're there going, what's antitrust? It's something I'd love to see more of in the modern day. But the short version is, antitrust laws are on the books to keep U.S. companies from either fixing prices so they all get a profit, instead of competing to make sure the customer gets the best price, or to keep acquisitions and mergers from going through, which leave a functional monopoly. If you want a recent example of antitrust, consider back to the early days of the internet. In 2001, the US government sued Microsoft for prepackaging its computers with its internal Internet Explorer browser. Now, Microsoft was, and still is, the most used operating system, and discussions of it being a monopoly is outside of the purview of this subject. However, what was going on was not that an internet browser was automatically installed. The issue was it was hard to switch. If Internet Explorer was removed from the computer would run into glitches. If AOL's competing Netscape browser was installed, it would work, but would require a complicated process instead of just appearing on screen like most other installed programs. Emails were submitted where Microsoft discussed how to, quote, cut off Netscape's air supply. The case found that Microsoft was acting as a monopoly. This led to computers that could install multiple browsers without crashing. This is objectively a better state for pretty much everyone using the internet, and an example of why we're going to be rooting for the antitrust lawsuits going forward. So, back to the studio systems. The first major domino in this is star contracts. While the Paramount case dealt with book blocking, the first crack came in 1944 by actress Olivia de Havilland. Olivia de Havilland, who died in 2020 at 104, was a multi-Academy Award-winning nominee in the early years of film. She had a contract with Warner Brothers, and her contract was like many of its time. She would work for Warner Brothers for a certain amount of time. In her case, it was 7 years. She could be loaned out to other studios, but if she refused to be loaned out or refused a role, she could be suspended for a certain amount of time, and the length would be added to the contract. Most of her Warner Brothers films were opposite Errol Flynn, and these movies were popular. The problem was, her best roles were when she had been loaned out. In Gone with the Wind by MGM, later sold to Fox, and Hold Back the Dawn by Paramount, she had been given both more complex roles and award nominations. So when the 7 years were up, Warner Brothers attempted to extend the contract for her 6-month suspension. She, however, sued. Well, not the first one. That seems to have been a failed attempt by Bette Davis, though others such as James Cagney also attempted it. De Havilland and her lawyer managed to successfully sue Warner Brothers, and by extension the entire studio system, were committing massive labor law violations. 7 years meant 7 calendar years under California law, not a day-by-day account. This had an almost immediate effect, allowing artists, mostly actors, to have greater control over their performances. They could accept or turn down roles without fear. De Havilland eventually got 2 Academy Awards and another nomination, and artists were no longer restricted to one studio, though remnants still linger on. In the MCU, or Marvel Cinematic Universe, the actors are often hired for a certain number of movies, though unlike under the studio system, they could independently accept roles outside of that. And okay, I admit I can't find the source, but I remember reading when the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie was coming out, Keira Knightley managed to get several considerations for her role as Elizabeth Swann, because her initial contract was for 2 movies, Pirates 1 and a movie of Disney's choosing, which was 2004's King Arthur, where she played a warrior queen version of Guinevere. And after Pirates 1 was a hit, she used the fact they needed a new contract to make sure Elizabeth wore boots. I'm pretty sure she also negotiated for more plot relevance, but since I can't find the article, I can't back that up. I do remember the boots, though, which is why I partly think she keeps on getting shots where you can see that she's actually wearing boots. Okay, so with the first domino down, the next one is a bit more serious. Book blocking. The practice of buying a large amount of movies sight unseen. For example, a studio would tell movie theaters that they had to buy several movies if they wanted the one with Bette Davis. How many? Well, there are allegations it would be an entire year's worth of movies in one theater. These movies would have little to no information, they may or may not even have been filmed yet. And there was another trick up their sleeve. Production companies would own the theaters. So how this would often work out in practice is, the studio makes a movie. This is their movie to get the awards or the money. They book it with several other movies that are sloppily made or very cheaply made or both. It will be sold first to the theaters they own for a good price, and if it does get sold to other theaters, it wasn't on such friendly terms. Maybe there were more movies in the blocking, or maybe the price was higher, or maybe they were only run it for a week, even if it was successful. This is speculated to have happened with The Wizard of Oz, in that the non-MGM studios removed it from their theaters quickly in order to promote their own movies. Independent theaters had no real bargaining power, and there are reports that turning down certain blocks could lead to them being threatened. At least independent theaters could set their own prices. Theaters owned by studios all had the same price, and there was not always a lot of theaters in a city. All in all, the whole system was a mess for anyone outside of the studio owners. Because, well, it was 1948. Movies had been around for just over 40 years, and it was obvious movies were capable of art. We've discussed King Kong, which was released in 1933, and how, besides being a great movie, it changed special effects forever. The 1925 Phantom of the Opera is one of the pinnacles of silent films and is still the most faithful adaptation of the book. The Oscars had been going for several years, and if you skim over the movies nominated for Best Picture before 1948, you get classics like All Quiet on the Western Front, Cleopatra, 42nd Street, Gone with the Wind, Hi, Olivia de Havilland, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Wizard of Oz, Rebecca, The Philadelphia Story, The Maltese Falcon, and Citizen Kane. And that's just up to 1941. And while that may make it seem like the studio system worked, that's what the studio's argument was. We achieved all that movie greatness under the studio system. Why bother changing it? Because, well, it wasn't competitive. Movies were pre-selected by book blocking instead of by interest or trends, and if the theater wasn't owned by the studios, then viewers may not have a chance to see it. And also, the rest of the movies that had made up book blocking were often not very good. So, in 1948, the U.S. sued Paramount Studios about this. At the same time, Howard Hughes, head of RKO, and a bit I brushed over in the King Kong episode because, well, it was incidental to the whole story, was also working on mitigating the lawsuit. It wasn't a surprise. There had been multiple attempts to try to stop this book blocking going back as far as the early 20s. In that time, the film industry had argued that both the system was too vertically integrated to fully break apart, and that this was the only way for production companies to really profit. But now World War II was over, and there was no more need for wartime propaganda. The excuses were done with, and the U.S. government under FDR and the Sherman Act were ready to dig in. Paramount lost. The government successfully argued that you couldn't use copyright as a way to control where and how often movies were shown. In addition, ticket prices couldn't be coordinated among unrelated movie theaters. That's price fixing and illegal. They also found out that profits had been distributed between the studios at pre-existing percentages. Also illegal. These tactics may have allowed the studios to guarantee survival, but didn't allow any real competition. This was combined with a related case, Shine vs. U.S., where the Shine Company owned all the theaters, also providing no real competition, especially for rerunning movies. So while Shine theaters were not owned by the production studios, they worked with them to get terms favorable to the theaters because in those areas there was no way else for the movies to be shown. Which leads to the non-legal reason the studio systems fell apart. Television. While commercial television had been around since the late 30s, in the next 5 years after 1948, it exploded in popularity. It was cheaper now to own a television than at any point before World War II, and in the 1950s, you would see the transition from what was essentially filmed radio, think Dragnet or Gunsmoke, to what would be proper television, such as I Love Lucy, Have Gun Will Travel, and The Honeymovers. Throw in RKO's failure, and the system collapsed. Mostly. Remnants of it are still around. As mentioned, Marvel actors are often signed for long contracts, and while they can technically do films outside of it, they do have other restrictions. I remember reading that when Chris Evans was cast in Snowpiercer, he wore the large overcoat because he couldn't lose the muscle mass for Captain America. They were filming Winter Soldier soon, but as a key plot point of Snowpiercer involves malnutrition, compromises had to be made. In the realm of non-theater distribution, specifically streaming, we still see studios arranging things to their own liking. Studios that have bought other properties, like when Disney bought 20th Century Fox in 2017, put their own prime creations front and center. Have you ever tried to search for Fox movies on Disney+? For a perfect example, take the underground gem Phantom of the Paradise, one of Fox's most influential cult horror movies, with movies, bands, and even manga artists citing it as an inspiration. If you do search for it on Disney+, you won't find it. Instead, it has to be rented from outside services such as Vudu. What you will find are movies like Big, a more family-friendly affair that slots in nicely with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, or Fox-owned Marvel movies like X-Men and Daredevil. And in 2022, Amazon Studios' acquisition of MGM raised eyebrows due to the increasing consolidation of studios, and as an exclusive streaming service, it could mimic movie theaters' contracts. For example, only allowing MGM movies to be shown on Amazon Prime. As for the theaters themselves, they've been in some turmoil. While legally the studios could not own theaters, in 1980 and 2019, the Department of Justice reviewed old antitrust cases, and they decided to sunset it in 2020. And then in June 2024, Sony Pictures bought Alamo Drafthouse. Netflix had already paved the way with buying some individual theaters in 2019. Though considering Netflix is famously an internet movie company and Oscar rules require movies to be in theaters for at least 1 week in New York and LA, you can see the appeal of them doing a limited release for Oscar reasons, then removing it so if anyone outside of those cities or were busy that week would instead need a Netflix subscription to see an Oscar nominee, which, the theaters were doing back in the 40s. So, where do we stand now? It's unclear. Movies now have to compete with high-quality TV, video games, and cell phones. COVID disrupted movie theaters with ramifications that are still unclear. Streaming residuals were a major part of the writers' and actors' strike, and movie theaters have to pay greater residuals than production company-owned streaming. The merging and acquisitions of various production companies lowers competition. It's a mess. But it's not unsurmountable. It just depends on antitrust being strengthened. But we will see how it all shakes out. Thank you for listening to Circuit Court Entertainment. If you found this episode interesting, please tell others as this is a new podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review on all the major podcast services. You can find me on Twitter at CCEPod and Tumblr at Circuit Court Entertainment. This episode was written, edited, and recorded by me, Mina. The script was edited by CJ Peterson. Podcast art by Empress Cirque on Twitter. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you soon.